Good afternoon. I'm Anka Chumba, member of the University of Chicago's Alumni Executive Committee and a proud graduate of the College and Booth School of Business. I am pleased to welcome you to today's Harper Lecture, 90 Seconds to Midnight, Assessing Humanity's Greatest Threats. Harper Lectures provide the alumni community with the opportunity to return to the classroom from wherever they are in the world, continuing our tradition of asking hard questions, dialoguing about critical topics, and pursuing new depths of knowledge and understanding. We will look forward to opening the floor to your questions later in the program. Please feel free to share your questions via the Q&A box at any time. It's now my pleasure to welcome today's speakers. Rachel Bronson, President and CEO of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. She oversees the management of the Doomsday Clock. Previously, Rachel served as Vice President of Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Senior Fellow and Director of Middle East Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. We also have Daniel Holtz, Chair of the Sciences and Security Board at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Additionally, he is a professor at the University of Chicago in the Department of Physics, Astronomy, and Astrophysics, the Enrico Fermi Institute, and the Kavli Institute for Cosmological Physics. Rachel and Daniel, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'll now turn it to you to the virtual stage.
Great, thank you, Anka, and I'm really delighted to be here with my colleague Daniel Holtz and with all of you here today. Thank you for your interest. What we thought we would do today is take the first half hour for a discussion between the two of us and then turn it over to your questions, which, as you heard, can get dropped into the Q&A chat, as Anka mentioned. And I thought what we would start with maybe is a little bit of an overview of the Doomsday Clock for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and a little bit on how it connects to the University of Chicago and a little bit about how we set it. Then we'll move into a conversation about the report itself that we issued in January and the setting of the time at 90 seconds to midnight. And then maybe a little bit about where there's some glimmers of optimism and where individuals are really making a difference. So that'll be how we'll hopefully plan out our conversation. So Daniel, why don't I just start a little bit about the Doomsday Clock and then turn it over to you for where I think people get really interested is who's involved in setting it and how you manage that, and then we'll turn over to the report itself. So for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists created the Doomsday Clock in 1947. A little bit about the Bulletin and why we're here talking with Chicago alums. As you may or may not know, the Bulletin was established by Manhattan Project scientists who were at the University of Chicago. So we have the kind of great minds at the time. Some had gone off to Los Alamos, some had stayed back. And they created a bulletin, literally a black and white 6-page bulletin in 1945, just 4 months after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they established that at the University of Chicago. Also, it included those from around the country as well. So J. Robert Oppenheimer was certainly in the news since the summer blockbuster. Albert Einstein was an early booster. But the whole point of the bulletin was to engage the public about this new technologies of our own making that had the potential to change life on Earth as we know it. The scientists could see what was coming with the development of nuclear technology. We were created by scientists, so scientists who were very bullish on all that nuclear could bring someday. So we are the beneficiaries through radiation treatments, through archaeological dating and all that, through their discoveries. We, as many of you may know, we power space, travels in space by nuclear energy, out there now exploring some of the planets. But at the time, obviously in 1945, it was weaponized and it was being used for weapons, and the technology was moving very, very quickly. So in 1939, Daniel has heard me tell the story. It's my favorite letter. It's 1939, Leo Szilard, who was at Manhattan Project Scientists at the University of Chicago. He is writing, along with Albert Einstein, a note to the president to say that it looks like not only would we be able to split the atom, but it was going to, had the potential to really change warfare as we knew it. And in the letter, he says that it might someday be floated into a port. And it's so powerful that if exploded, it would destroy the port. That was in 1939. By 1942, we actually do split the atom. By 1945, so just 6 years later, it's destroying whole cities. And by 1952, we are testing hydrogen bombs. In 1953, the Soviets are testing hydrogen bombs, which has the potential, as we now know, thousands of times more powerful in some sort of a strategic exchange to end life on Earth as we know it. So the technology is moving very, very quickly. This bulletin is created to engage the public. And in 1947, they become a magazine, and they're looking for literally a cover for its Time magazine, Life magazine. They need a cover, and so Alexander Langsdorff, a University of Chicago professor and involved in the Manhattan Project, he turns to his wife, Martha Langsdorff, a well-known Chicago-based artist, to create the cover, and she creates the clock. And she creates it because she understands how anxious her husband and his colleagues are, and the need for the public to get engaged, to literally pull back the hands on the doomsday clock. So she creates a clock, and that's on our first cover in 1947. In 1949, the editor, then Eugene Rabinowitz, also University of Chicago professor, moves the hands of the clock forwards. It was set at 7 minutes to midnight, moves it to 3 minutes to midnight. And he does that because the Soviets have now tested their atomic bombs. Then they move it to 2 minutes to midnight in 1953 as a response to the hydrogen bomb. So this very dynamic, this very static image becomes dynamic. And then over time becomes a globally recognized symbol, metaphor for how close are we to destroying life on Earth as we know it. I'm going to turn it over to Daniel in a second, but one of the most pivotal and probably controversial moves that the Bulletin made, and we've made several, so we can talk about them with your questions, but was actually in 2009 when we moved it because of climate change, or 2007, excuse me, it's one of those. We moved it for climate. So the Bulletin has long been covering nuclear issues, and it's known for that. But from the very beginning, we were covering existential threats as well. And throughout the history of the Bulletin, there's a lot of debates of what is this? Are we about nuclear, or are we about existential threats? And we had been writing about climate, we've been writing about population increases, we've been writing about biological threats, all of that. But by adding climate in the early 2000s to the movement of the clock, we basically came out with a declaration that climate was an existential threat, which we had been writing about for many years at that point, and that the doomsday clock represented existential threat, not just nuclear threats. We can certainly talk about that, but I wanted to make sure we all had kind of a frame of the Bulletin as an institution. We're located in the Harris School of Public Policy now, so we're connected to our heritage. The Science and Security Board of the Bulletin, our scientific advisors, set the clock now since the passing of Eugene Rabinowitz back in the 70s. And Daniel Holtz is the chair of our Science and Security Board and a well-established professor at the University of Chicago. And that body sets the times of the doomsday clock and also informs the work of the Bulletin throughout the year. Because there's often many questions of how does this fit and how is it set and who is it, without going into too much details, I did want to turn it over to Daniel to introduce himself and talk a little bit about the clock as a process and also a clock as a message device. So Daniel, can I turn that over to you, and maybe you can update folks on how we think about that?
Yeah, so thanks, Rachel, and thank you all for being here and for discussing what can be a somewhat somber topic. You know, as Rachel said, it's really particularly appropriate for this community to have this discussion because of the long history. The organization was originally the Atomic Scientists of Chicago. It was very explicit, and as Rachel also mentioned, the Bulletin offices are housed here on campus at Harris. Okay, so I'll give just a kind of an overview of things. The first thing probably everyone should know is the time, the current time of the doomsday clock. And right now we're at 90 seconds to midnight. And that time is the same time it was last year, which could be good news or bad news, depending on how you look at that. The thing to remember, and I think this will probably inform a lot of our subsequent discussion, the thing to remember is 90 seconds to midnight is the closest the clock has ever been to midnight. You know, in the entire time that the clock has been set and been moving backwards and forwards, this moment in our judgment is the closest we've ever been to sort of the end of civilization. And so there, you know, we have a long document where we go through the reasons for this setting and the things that concern us and the things that give us hope. So if you want to, you know, hear more, I would encourage you to read that. The short version of, so I should say the way this works is there's a group of us, it's about 20 scientists, experts on policy, people that have thought about climate or nuclear issues. We also have cyber expertise, we have bio expertise. It's kind of a broad range. And we all get together and we sort of assess the state of the world. And we sort of ask ourselves, are things getting better or worse? What are the areas of concern? What are the sort of scenarios that could end up in global devastation, and how do we think about these, and how do we assess how things are going? And there's a lot of discussion and debate, and we go back and forth. The separate groups kind of give their assessments, and then we all get together and we kind of hash out and come to a consensus, and we ended up at 90 seconds. So that's kind of the process. The main issues for this current time were there's still this nuclear threat. It's the same threat that was anticipated when the bulletin was founded. One thing I think it's really worth emphasizing is the bulletin, in 1945, when it was founded, was already highlighting all the things that could go wrong. There are these very clear statements from these scientists at a moment where they're really only the US had these weapons. They were only fission weapons, so they were not fusion bombs, hydrogen bombs. So they were very, from today's perspective, extremely limited weapons. There were a tiny number of them. Only one nation had them. And even then, they anticipated, well, what could happen, certainly we don't have a lock on this technology, on these insights. This is just physics. Other nations will figure this out, develop their own. There could very well be this escalation. I think people even then knew that the physics allowed for hydrogen bombs, which have essentially unlimited yield. So, fission bombs can get, big, but it's limited. Hydrogen bombs can go out. The sun is, in some sense, a hydrogen bomb. It can scale up dramatically. And so they could see that the weapons were only going to get stronger. There'd be more of them, more nations would have them, unless we sorted ourselves out, sort of adopted a new way of thinking. This could obliterate civilization. They could see all that very early. They said it explicitly. We're worried about this. This is part of the reason for the bulletin. So that's kind of where they were then. Here we are now, and all of these things are still true, the things they were worried about. There are now, some number of nations with these weapons. These weapons are on high alert. There are many of them. If they're all launched and detonated, that's pretty much it. We can talk about the details, but it's devastating for civilization. So that threat still looms. The clearest example of that is Ukraine, where you've had threats, direct threats, be careful or we're going to use our nuclear weapons. It's high tension, and it involves, NATO and Russia, both, nuclear armed and not really communicating, and in very clear, almost direct conflict. So they're very if you spend your life kind of thinking about this, what are the things that can go wrong? This is the kind of scenario that terrifies you. So that's going on. Meanwhile, last year was the hottest year on record. Climate change is clearly happening at this point. If anything, it's happening a little worse than the models predict, which is slightly unnerving. But the overall trends are in accord with all the models. This is the sort of things like the extremes, the kind of climatic events of fires and flooding. This is all what was expected to happen, what was predicted. And this is only the beginning. It's going to get much worse. All the models say that. That's a disaster, very unsettling. That's clearly a concern. We're not doing enough. That being said, there are some reasons for hope there, and that's a major part of, we kind of go back and forth. There's reason for alarm and there's reason for hope, and finding that balance is very important. And then there are other things of concern. We're still coming out of this pandemic, and there's been a lot of discussion about what the next pandemic might bring. The role of AI is, of course, on everyone's minds. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but that fits very squarely into the sorts of things we're concerned about, technological developments and what they mean for the future. And so kind of combining all of these things together, we ended up at 90 seconds to midnight. So Rachel, maybe that was a little long, but.
No, that's fine. I thought what I would do then, since we're at the conversation about the 90 seconds, and also let everybody know on the call that, as Daniel alluded to, every year we issue a statement. So to kind of back up the time. So if you do want to know more, the university has the statement. It's on our website at thebulletin.org, and it really is a way to let you know why we said it where we do. The purpose, a question that we often get about, well, why do we do this? And then, you can hear from Daniel, we're very concerned about the state of things, as many people are. So why do we do that? And is it a scare tactic? And does it have that effect? And the reason we do that is because these are really complicated issues to think about. And they're hard to think about them on a daily basis, right? I mean, pick up our kids, drop them off, pay the rent, right? Whatever we're doing, and then thinking about nuclear warfare is usually kind of under the top three. But the doomsday clock does a couple of things. One is it does stop the news cycle and provides an opportunity each year when we announce it for the media and others to focus on these very complicated issues. More importantly, I think, is it provides an entrance ramp, if you will, for us to talk about these issues. So what we hope comes from this, often a question we'll receive, is that you and your neighbors or colleagues, or you're in the elevator and you see it come through. After it, I'm sure there's initial like, oh, here it is again. But what we hope and what we see certainly among school kids, I've gotten calls this year again from them or others, is like, do you think we got it right? If you were setting the time, what time would you set it at? And why? What would you put into your clock? So we're very clear that this, for us, the clock is measuring existential threats, threats to humanity, the life as we know it. And we do believe that it has gotten worse over the last number of years, and we can chart that. And the reason why is, if I can really kind of simplify it, it's a lack of global governance around issues of science and technology's advancement, right? So what we see in the nuclear space, the best example of it, but you can see it in climate and even in kind of like the bioengineering and other technologies, is the inability to globally govern global challenges. And those challenges are becoming more significant. So that's my simple take on it, on how I make sense of all of the issues that we're focusing on, how Daniel laid it out. And so in the nuclear space, where I think it's most easiest maybe to talk about, is that starting in the kind of late 50s, especially the early 60s, right around the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had so terrified ourselves with the effects of our own making that the United States and the Soviets, at the moment of greatest terror, if you will, the Cuban Missile Crisis, came together and began thinking about how to put in place confidence building measures, verification of treaties, began to think about how we could reduce the threats. And really from about 1970 to 2010, we had what I would call the golden age of arms control. It was still very dangerous. Anyone who lived through the 70s, 80s knows that it was a very dangerous time. But we also had a robust and growing architecture around how to manage these technologies, and really reduced the number and the kinds of tasks that we were doing and all of that to create a safer environment. By 2010, when we had the last nuclear arms control agreement between the US and the now Russians, we've had a serious deterioration, a recognition that these agreements no longer held up with the advancements of technology, throwing our hands in the air. More states now in today's world, we're focused very much on what China's doing and significantly increasing its nuclear arsenal. But we were unable to govern the advancements that we were seeing. And science continued to move. And so the technologies were proliferating. And again, what I find most interesting about the technologies that we look at, they tend to be dual use. And we were created by scientists. So we are not anti-science on this. We, in fact, are quite bullish on all of the great and good things that science will bring. But we're not cheerleaders, unabashed cheerleaders, because without the political apparatus around it, we all know it can be very, very dangerous and used by bad actors dangerously. And that's what we are most concerned with. And so what we've seen, again, just using the nuclear area, is a real deterioration and abandonment of any belief that we can do anything. The US and the Russians really walking away, each responding to the other to do so. And now we are left with one agreement basically left between the US and now Russians, at a moment where China is vesting very significantly. One more point on this, and this I do, if there's one thing on the nuclear space that I'd love to leave you all with, is every major nuclear power is investing in their nuclear weapons as if they are usable. That is what is driving the nuclear piece of this clock, which is, we are far from the days of Reagan and Gorbachev of a nuclear war can never be won, must never be fought. And we're far from that. It does not look like we, the Russians, the Chinese, the British are investing, the Pakistanis are investing. There are investments around the world at North Koreans as if these are usable. So there are other issues. Daniel talked a bit about climate. On AI, we kind of consider this an Oppenheimer moment. And maybe I'll turn it. I see we're about to go to Q&A. But Daniel, maybe we can just talk about the op-ed that you and I wrote, where we also focused on some of the glimmers of hope, notwithstanding the fact that it's at 90 seconds, and we believe it should be at 90 seconds. But we do talk about agency and things people are and can do. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go to the audience's Q&A.
Yeah, sure. So I think, the hope aspect is all in the context of, here we are, the closest we've ever been. And so the question is, where do we go from here? And so, for example, for climate, there are some glimmers of hope, in the sense that I think at this point, for better or worse, the world is acknowledging that climate change is happening, that the science is correct, that the predictions are right, and that we're the ones that are doing it because we're burning fossil fuels. And that's a major step. And the reason, I think, one of the reasons that there's been that transition, sadly, is because it's obvious. If you just look at the headlines, there's been so much, climatic unrest, globally, that I think people are seeing that we really are fundamentally changing the planet we live on for the worse. And that's extremely problematic, but it means, sort of the first step is to recognize you have a problem. I think my perception is the world is there. We recognize we have a problem. Meanwhile, technology has improved by leaps and bounds. We now have these renewables such as wind and solar. The price of renewables has dropped. The uptake has been dramatic, probably more significant than most people thought was possible 5 or 10 years ago. It's really a very encouraging story. If that continues, that would be wonderful. It's not fast enough, but at least it's happening. And that is a reason for hope. And a reason for hope, I would claim at this point that it's not really as much a technological problem. I think there are lots of reasons to believe that we can address climate change, decarbonize our energy infrastructure. It's sort of political will, the appropriate investments, and those investments are starting to happen. And so there are reasons for optimism there. Similarly, something like AI or in general disinformation, I think that's something that, again, there's a growing awareness, especially in the last year, that this is a concern. And you've had the scientists working on AI, as Rachel alluded to, the very scientists doing the research, excited, making the developments, some of them standing up and saying, we're terrified about what we're creating. It's very unsettling. We think this has the potential to be an existential risk. It's reminiscent of the Manhattan Project scientists that founded the Bulletin. Exactly the kind of language that was used back then is now being used now by some of the scientists. The ones that really are in the trenches doing the work are standing up and saying, I'm uncomfortable. And some of them are just outright saying, I'm not going to work on this anymore. I think it's too dangerous. So that's alarming. That's something we should track. But the fact that they're doing it, that they're getting visibility and that governments are responding. There's been activity in Europe. There have been a number of executive orders and meetings, and there's stuff developing to try to control the threats and kind of control the pace, and that's also encouraging. The worst is when there's an existential risk that everyone is completely ignoring, and I think. So in this, there's reason for hope. Again, it's not happening fast enough. We're still extremely concerned. There are plenty of narratives where things go badly for humanity, but at least there are also some developments in the positive side, and we'll have to see. I mean, the hope is we get to turn back the clock, that these developments are successful and that things get better. And we just, time will tell. The problem is we just don't have that much time. For climate, things are, this is building up. It's one of these things where you can't decide in 40 years, oh yeah, this is something we have to address. By then it's clearly too late, in the sense that the planet will have been so fundamentally transformed that it will be in some ways unrecognizable to the planet that we know today and that all of civilization has developed on. And so we just don't want to get there. We have to do everything we can now.
So we're at the point in this conversation where we take your questions, and I can tell you I've just been scrolling through. We have well more than we'll be able to answer, but they're really good ones, and I'm sorry that we can't get to all of them, and I'll try to bunch them as best we can. One question, well, there was somebody who actually met his wife at the Bulletin, who she was the circulation manager. And so thank you for that. I love hearing stories like that. There was a question about books to read. There's plenty, and certainly plenty on all of these particular issues. On existential kind of threats more generally, I love Martin Rees's works. I think he's got a very short book. I was going to go kind of grab it. It's on my bookshelf. That I think it's his. Just looking here, no, it's not it. It's either his last one or the one before. And I'd highly recommend it. Short read helps frame it out a bit. Daniel's teaching a class on Are We Doomed? So he'll have some thoughts on books to read as well. A skeptic, just to be even-handed about this, a real skeptic is Steven Pinker, who thinks things like the doomsday clock just instill fear and are unhelpful. I have a response to Steven Pinker in the bulletin, and of course, read the bulletin. So there's just some thoughts, but there's plenty others, and Daniel might have others, and happy to answer a few offline. There is a question about, and I do want to get to Russia because there's a lot of questions on Russia, but there is a question about, do you believe that the end of civilization is inevitable? And Daniel, I'll let you answer that in books and a next question. But I don't. I think it's a very dangerous time. And I think I'm often asked, like, how do I get up in the morning? But the fact is the clock has moved back away from midnight, and it's done it repeatedly. It's moved forward and backwards 25 times in its history since 1947, and it's moved close, and continuously closer of the last few years. But I don't believe it's inevitable, because we've moved it back before. At the end of the Cold War, we saw a real reduction in nuclear weapons. We have seen the countries coming together and working to address real changes. There were moments where we thought with the Chinese on climate change, that might be an area that we could work on. The fact, as Daniel and I have written, and he alluded to the fact that there's been $1.7 trillion invested over the last year in renewables. There's still been $1 trillion invested in fossil fuels, but we are capable of this. It's just very, very difficult, and it can be very slow. What worries us is kind of a defeatism that we can't do it, and an abandonment of responsibilities, which we've been seeing of late, in trying to seriously address these problems at a global level with real seriousness. That is dangerous, and that is cause for pessimism, but we've shown our ability to push back the hands of the doomsday clock. And I believe we can do it again. I think conversations like this, and then what we take away from it, and how we act after that, and how we vote, and all of that has real impact. And the fact that this year over half the planet will be voting, we're hoping that these issues focus some of their attention. Daniel, maybe I'll turn it over to you to, some books that you've liked teaching from, and then maybe you can comment on how we responded to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and I'll either pick it up from there or jump into another question.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm going to start with this issue of, the long-term future, and, are we doomed? So I am teaching a class on that, and we've had lots of discussions of the ways we could be doomed, and, what can be done and how to think about this. There's an aspect of this which I think is sort of assumed here, which is that that we're at a unique moment in history. And so I think this is true. This is a good kind of UChicago type of question. I think probably every, generation believes they're at a unique moment in history. I would argue that over the last, decade, since 45, it is unique in the history of civilization in that we clearly hold the power to destroy, all of civilization, directly ourselves. And that seems fairly unique. And what's happened, that was nuclear, but now with climate, we are clearly in a position where we're directly, impacting our planet. That's also not happened before. And now with these other things such as AI and misinformation and engineered bioweapons, and there are many ways that just humanity can do itself in. So I think that's new. There's also this other trend, which Rachel also alluded to, which is that because of scientific and engineering developments, we're also kind of at a unique moment where we have the kind of ability to just sort of increase the standard of living, or really increase the kind of ability to you know, kind of as humanity, sort of as one humanity, move humanity forward to a point where we're not all, you know, desperately just trying to find food to feed ourselves or shelter, but we can kind of move to this other, you know, long-term future where our lives are spent in a kind of different way, something maybe we can't even conceive of now, that we're kind of in this transition period. We have the food, you know, we have the technology to feed everyone. We have the technology to clothe everyone. We have I mean, as as solar panels continue to drop in price, we'll have the technology to provide everyone with kind of what we need to live. And we could be at this just really this critical inflection point in humanity. Exactly what that means in practice is less clear, but there are definitely people that believe this is the moment. If we can make it through these, you know, decades, maybe this century, humanity will truly blossom, and then eventually we'll go to, you know, other planets, and you know, there's this far flung, you know, far future scenario, which, you know, sounds like science fiction, but you know, everything about our lives now would be science fiction to someone from 100 years ago. So I'm hesitant to kind of dismiss any of those things. So the point of all this is this could be a key moment right now where humanity kind of decides whether we're going to kind of preserve our planet. I mean, here we are, we know we're destroying our planet. We see the effects. It affects everyone. And yet we're moving pretty slowly. The alarm isn't quite there. Similarly with nuclear, no one wants a nuclear war. It's in no one's interest to destroy all the cities and have nuclear winter and our food system collapses and billions of deaths. No one wants that. And yet we could easily end up in that scenario just by accident, by some, you know, miscommunication or miscalculation. The fact that that's still possible and that, you know, individuals can bring that to pass. There are just, you know, there are people with their fingers on the butt, individuals that can just end civilization. The fact that we've kind of engineered a civilization where we give one person the ability to do that, it just is hard to comprehend, but that's where we are. Hopefully we move through that, maybe apply checks and balances, maybe eventually reduce that threat. But this is where we are now. So the question of the kind of, you know, is this a unique moment? I would claim yes. Is there a vision for a future where these threats decline? For sure, as Rachel said, the clock has moved forward and back over the years. We're at this closest point. We can only hope that now we move back. Often what happens is people get incredibly alarmed. You come close, like, and that may be happening with climate. Now you start to see, you know, oh, this really is a threat. And then people start to act. Maybe we're there. You know, we can only hope so. For books, there are a bunch of, so the syllabus for this class, Are We Doomed, is online. And so I would encourage you to go check it out. And we have tons of books. We have both books that are kind of part of the lectures. So, you know, we have lecture, you know, we'll have you know, we're discussing nuclear, or we're discussing disinformation or AI, and then we'll have readings attached to those. And then we'll also have additional readings. You know, here are some good science fiction books, or here are some movies to watch. And there's a lot there. So for anything you're interested in, we can provide something. And I think that actually is linked off my website, or it's definitely linked off the XLab website. I should mention just, you know, we also have a new initiative at UChicago called the University of Chicago Existential Risk Laboratory, which has just started, XLab for short. And we're doing a lot of activities, including trying to develop programs for undergraduates and developing a kind of research project, interdisciplinary research project on existential risk across campus. And there's a lot of information on that site as well about various activities. And I think on that site, there's a link to the syllabus. I'll try to pass it along to you right now as well in the chat.
Thank you. And then, and also please do check out the bulletin, you know, that we have people writing there every day, and so you can certainly follow our work there. There are a lot of questions about Russia, and then also how we set the clock. And so Daniel will talk a little bit about the process, but let me just talk about the invasion of Ukraine and how we thought about it, and how we're thinking about today's news, right? About the anti-satellite weapon that the Russians, that we just announced to the world that the Russians were working on. So first off, there was a question of why didn't we change it with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? In fact, we were pretty active around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we were taking Vladimir Putin's threats very seriously because of the risk of accident. That when it comes to nuclear threats, there's of course the fear that there will be an intentional deployment of nuclear weapons. The Russians actually militarily train to operate as if nuclear weapons are used. There's a lot of development in smaller yield nuclear weapons, which there's a very active debate of whether they're stabilizing or destabilizing. We publish on both. Most of our experts believe it's destabilizing, but not all of them. And so, but what we really feared is accidents and kind of misunderstandings. We know from history, in the fog of war, that accidents and misperceptions are a consequential part of wars and their outcomes. And so anything that makes use more likely or adds opacity to the environment is very dangerous, and we're very worried about it. So leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, we were particularly focused on that, not only because it was a war that seemed likely to break out. There are plenty of those, and they happen often. Unfortunately, we're kind of faced with that right now between Israel and Hamas, but we were focused particularly on Russia because of its stockpile of nuclear weapons, and because the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and many around him were advocating and actively using it to threaten and deter. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were taking that very seriously. And then when Russia started attacking Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear power plant, we were again taking that very seriously. We convened the Science and Security Board, who issued a statement about real concerns about what we were seeing, and that's on our website. We didn't move the clock because at that point we were at 100 seconds to midnight, and we meant it when we were at 100 seconds to midnight, that this was the most dangerous it had ever been. And this is exactly what we worried about. We worried about these kind of destabilizing situations that had the potential for significant consequences. And in fact, the invasion itself and the threats were exactly the kinds of things we were worried about, and why we had moved it to 100 seconds. When it came to setting the clock again, now we're a few months later, and we saw the continuation of these threats and the threat levels, and the threat to raise threat levels and all of that, we did move the clock then at 90 seconds. What we try not to do, and some of this has come up in the chat, we try not to be responding directly to every event as we see it, because we know that often it takes time to unfold and understand what's behind it. So we do try to have some sort of perspective on it, but it is why we issued the statement, and then ultimately we moved it to 90 seconds to midnight. There was some debate this year about whether we should move it back to 100, given that we didn't see the use of nuclear weapons. But because of the precipice on which we are operating, nobody really felt, or overwhelmingly, we didn't feel comfortable to move it back. In fact, we felt that it still deserved to remain where it was, and we didn't see anything put in place to make it less likely that those nuclear weapons would use. And in fact, we see a continuation of the threats and rhetoric around it. Now, how do we think about today's news? we're thinking about today's news. It's kind of breaking, right? So, but a little bit of my sense of how we would probably be reading it. Again, the SASC hasn't convened around it, and so I'm not speaking for them. I'm speaking for my kind of a sense on how to read it. Is that this is about the continued and increasing militarization of space. This is about the fear that satellites could go down that would affect civilization as we know it. There is a nuclear story to this about the nuclearization of space, but the immediate consequences of should this ever happen would be about what's happening in space and basically a cyber attacks and the threat to bring down all the communication grids that we require, that we require for our civilization. So it is real. We would consider it in the context of cyber. It is still a long way off from being executed. But if you look at the statements, we do have members of our group who have been watching this militarization of space and have been calling it out because of both the kind of the threats on the treaties of there's treaties against nuclearizing space. So this is just like one more threat to that, to yet one of the few treaties that still exist. And we are worried about it for the nuclear aspect, but real and importantly, the cyber component of it. So how we make sense of it, how we understand it, how we factor in the continued stress on the few remaining treaties that organize our behavior, that would be, for conversation, and most likely you'll see that kind of reflected in our next statement. But I would imagine unlikely to move it in the moment for some of those reasons. However, yeah, and however, that is in this context of a 90 seconds and the complete collapse of any sort of guardrails around the US-Russian nuclear relationship. Daniel, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just was gonna kind of, echo that. The bottom line here is we've been worried about these deteriorating relationships for a while. And we've called out the militarization of space as a particular area of concern, but really this is just emblematic of everything that's happening now. There's distrust between the US and Russia and between the US and China, and that's leading to, arms races in space, arms race on the ground, the pace of future war. There's been all this stuff about hypersonics. That everything is changing, and it's changing in a way that, first of all, there's less trust. And the weapon systems are all kind of accelerating in their kind of potency, accuracy, and just timeliness. And that combination is very destabilizing. And you add to that now, instead of what used to be a kind of bipolar world where it was really just the US and for a long time the Soviet Union, and that was the relationship to manage. Now there's also China in the mix, and all three nuclear powers are trying to manage and kind of win the arms race, and that's unstable. That there is no way to kind of end up in a situation where one nation can beat the other nations. Everyone then just adjusts, and it just escalates upwards. It's extremely concerning, and it's just, we're watching it happen. And this latest is just an example of every nation trying to one-up each other in its technology, and then everyone responds. Underlying all this, I just remind everyone, there are enough nuclear weapons to, blow up the world many times over. We don't need any of these developments. The idea that you can do a preemptive strike and, eliminate the other and then protect yourself, I think that's a fantasy that we thought we had retired decades ago. And the fact that that language is still present and that people are still developing these weapons with the idea that they can be used and we can win is extremely alarming. And I think that's part of the reason we're the closest we've ever been to midnight. And a lot of this, so these, day-to-day headlines are just kind of fitting into the narrative that we're already kind of anticipating, we've been freaking out about for a while. which is why we're so close. One of the reasons we're so close to, we're this close, you know, at 92nd is because there's these concerns. So all it does is kind of confirm that the time is probably correct for us.
Great, we're coming to the end of our time, and there's still a lot of great questions. So maybe Maggie had a question. Do scientists feel that climate change is now a greater threat than nuclear concerns? And I think where we are on that is these are two existential threats. We certainly see them this way, and I think a lot of scientists see it that way. And what I think is important at the bulletin is the belief that you can't trade off one existential threat for another. And so, for example, let me maybe share with you an idea from one of our Science and Security Board members, Rod Sokolow, who I think gets this exactly right, is that we can't just trade them off. And what does he mean by that? Rob Sokolow is pretty interested in nuclear power as being part of a solution to climate change. But you can't have nuclear power unless you're confident that we can keep it safe. And so he thinks about this. And there's different threats that nuclear power creates. It can be through accident, through not being able to handle the waste, but it can also be being mined by a terrorist and or used as a stockpiling for fuel. And so in his view, the way he'll talk about it, and I find it pretty compelling, is if you think that nuclear power can and should be part of a climate solution, you have to be a strong advocate for arms control and verification, and have a real understanding of what's happening with nuclear programs, that they're not being weaponized, but they're being used to generate power. So for example, and this is, I would argue, the Iran deal that was so controversial, understandably, a few years ago, had in it the notion that the Iranians, they would reduce a lot of their military programs, but they had a right through the NPT to advance nuclear power. That was very controversial. In those agreements, we had written into it a very extensive verification and monitoring set of agreements that would literally put Americans and others into those facilities shoulder to shoulder with the Iranians, watching what was happening. It's the best form of information sharing, and it was very revolutionary when it comes to arms control. This was an example of how you might advance nuclear power to handle over time a climate situation while bounding it through arms control agreements. It was, as we know, there was a lot of fights, and a lot of people did not believe it was robust enough and this and that, and eventually the US pulled itself out of that agreement. But it's the kind of crossover that we should be thinking about, rather than figuring out which is more existential than the other. Existential is existential, and they're both crises. Daniel, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question and really important discussion. And I think one thing to emphasize is that none of these risks exist alone. You know, we're one planet and all this stuff interrelates, which is part of the reason that it's particularly difficult to solve these and particularly urgent. And so for climate, you could say, oh, I mean, climate has its own direct impacts, but what will happen with climate is, and we know this, and we're already starting to see it, is there will be, millions, hundreds of millions of climate refugees. That's extremely destabilizing for nations. That leads to various developments. There will be wars over resources, water, arable land. We're looking at a planet that becomes much more unstable because of climate change. That leads to conflict. When you have rampant conflict, the probability of a nuclear exchange goes way up. Even a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan would be devastating, That's a region which will be directly impacted by climate, and how that region responds is very unclear. This is true around the world. And so I would say, kind of picking between them is hard. All of it is all together in one. And the same thing with disinformation and the loss of kind of agreed upon facts, and, what I would call rational discourse being undermined by AI and social media and everything that, people talk about. That is also extremely concerning. And it again impacts climate, our ability to address climate and nuclear. So it's all kind of a huge concern, and it's all interrelated. So trying to pick one or rank them, it's very difficult for us, because even if nuclear is your greatest concern, climate disinformation comes directly into your ability to address the nuclear threat. So we really have to address all of them simultaneously. And that's kind of part of our message, is we should be alarmed, and we should all kind of work to kind of turn back the clock and address these issues.
Yeah, so we're at the end of our time. I'm told we have time for one last question. So let me just go through kind of a rapid kind of response, and then I'll turn it back over to Anka. Carrie Shug asks, has anybody been calculating how much reflective dust we would have to launch into the near space to reduce sunlight and stop runaway climate change? Do we have enough rocket power? It's really too big for this, but I just want to say that what this notion of geoengineering that is really kind of picking up speed as we face this crisis. I know there's a lot of concern at the Bulletin about ideas like this, because once you start relying on these examples of throwing dust into the air, we don't fully understand the consequences worldwide of that, but also you'll have to continue doing that as we continue to pump more and more carbon into the atmosphere. You need more and more of that dust to kind of manage the sunlight, and we're moving pretty quickly in terms of experiments around this. And at least at the Bulletin, we have real concerns about that we're publishing on every day as the science advances. It's exactly what we talked about, the need to kind of understand both sides, the risks and benefits of all of these technologies, and as a citizenry really have conversations about that. I want to just move quickly to AI too.
Wait, can I just jump in just very fast?
Very quickly,
So
yeah.
the U Chicago connection, we should acknowledge there's a new U Chicago initiative called the Climate Systems Engineering Initiative, which is specifically designed to address those sorts of questions and try to figure out what would be, involved, and what the risks might be, and does this make sense? And across the full, range, including the kind of parasols out in space and everything else, like just try to understand what can be done.
Absolutely. And I think that's where we're also on AI, and this, I'm going to wrap up with this, is that we think an Oppenheimer moment where there's enormous benefits that AI is going to bring, along with, as we've been hearing a lot, real concerns. And the challenge is, again, to figure out how to govern this technology. And there's actually some pretty interesting things being done globally, and it's probably one of the more interesting areas to watch, but a lot of work still needs to be done. I want to thank everybody on behalf of me and Daniel and the Bulletin. And Anka, I'm going to turn it back over to you to maybe see us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Rachel and Daniel, for this insightful conversation. And thank you to you, our audience, for your wonderful questions. I hope that you'll continue to engage with the university and the alumni community, whether that's by attending another event, volunteering, providing philanthropic support for our faculty, students, or simply spreading the word about the groundbreaking work and thought leadership happening at the university. So you can learn more about opportunities to do all of this on the Alumni and Friends website, and that's alumniandfriends.uchicago.edu. So thank you all for coming together with our University of Chicago community today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.